why the age of Trump is now going to be normalized with or without Trump. And what I worry, especially with the signing today of the American Rescue Plan, will be the inability on the part of the ruling Democratic elites to counter this movement which Trump embodied. There was a very concerted assault. It began in 1971, if you want to fix a date to it, when the business elites decided to respond to what the political scientist Samuel Huntington called our excess of democracy. What Huntington was referring to is the rise of popular movements in the 1960s, not just the anti-war movement, but the women's movement, the environmental movement. Ralph Nader founded the first Earth Day, indigenous groups like AIM, the Black Panthers. And so this frightened the ruling elites, and they mounted a concerted and unfortunately exceedingly successful campaign to roll back that opening and close the or shut down or eradicate the programs that had addressed social inequality, many of them put in place by the New Deal, but also by Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And if you read the Lewis Powell memo, 1971, Powell was the attorney for the Chamber of Commerce, later was appointed to the Supreme Court. He really lays out how that assault will be carried out. And that meant creating think tanks like the Heritage Foundation. It meant flooding money into the universities to essentially buy loyalty in political science departments, economic departments. It meant taking control of the airwaves. It meant using that money to demonize, marginalize, and push out of the mainstream critics of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism never made any economic sense. It was based on the fringe elements of the of economic theorists, Hayek, and this kind of third-rate novelist, Ayn Rand, etc. But it made sense in terms of justifying the pillage by the ruling elites, which is all that really mattered. And people who didn't pay fealty to this neoliberal ideology were really ruthlessly silenced. And so with the perpetuation of this ideology, the idea that if you deregulate the market, this will stimulate the economy, and there will be that kind of magical trickle-down effect, which of course is a myth. In fact, what it does is accrue political and economic power to that tiny oligarchic elite, which is of course where we are now. The 664 billionaires just during the pandemic alone saw their wealth increase by 44%. That's $1.3 trillion. So they gathered such force within both the social, cultural, and political establishment that in order to survive politically, you had to pay fealty to them, which is how you got the figure like Bill Clinton. Clinton, much like Tony Blair, Clinton transformed the Democratic Party into the Republican Party and pushed the Republican Party so far to the right it became insane. And he, with Biden was a major architect in the Senate at the time. We essentially entered that era after the Clinton administration of what I would call the faux liberal. So the faux liberal is the person like Clinton, like Obama, to a lesser extent like Biden, but it's the people who are tolerant on cultural, societal issues in terms of race or gender equality, but assiduously serve corporate power. And I think this was emblematic within the Obama administration, where after Obama was given a mandate after the 2008 crash, and he immediately turned his services to bolstering Wall Street and the banking industry and I think the rise of Trump was tied directly to Obama's very flagrant betrayal of the working class and of the mandate in which he had been given. to confront the elites, and his refusal, of course, to do so. Why do you get a figure like Trump? Clearly a con artist, vulgar, crude, inept, a narcissist, because there is so much pain, especially among the white working class. Not that there isn't more pain among marginal communities, people of color in urban areas, but we have to remember that the two primary forms of social control in those areas are now so draconian and so fierce that it makes any kind of organized resistance almost impossible. What are those? Those are the police, militarized police, which now function as internal armies of occupation, and of course the system of mass incarceration. About why African American men in particular don't have the same kind of midlife crisis that white men have. And he said because it's black people very early on learn that the myth of America, of American exceptionalism, of meritocracy is a lie. And those old UAW workers voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary, but they voted for Trump in the general election. Why? Why that swing from a Sanders to a Trump? It's because the anger towards the Democratic Party elites is particularly fierce because the betrayal was deeper. The Democratic Party, which once took into account the concerns of labor, continued after they betrayed the American working class to speak in that feel your pain language of liberalism while they thrust a knife into the back of the American working class. I think it's important to note that Trump himself had no real ideology, but that ideological vacuum was filled by the Christian right. And it was the failure of the liberal church, which I come out of, to denounce these people, to confront these people for who they were. The fascism, as Aaron, it always entails magical thinking, but it also fuses the iconography and language of the movement, of the fascist movement. And Trump brought all of these figures, Pompeo, Pence, Betsy DeVos, who come out of this Christian nationalist or Christian fascist movement into the administration, and they have remained his most loyal base. And I think that the myopia or naivete of the ruling elites is that they somehow think Trump was a kind of freakish anomaly, and they think they can make Trump and his supporters disappear by banishing them from social media and recreate the ancien regime with that kind of decorum of the imperial presidency and respect for procedural norms and choreographed elections and fealty to neoliberalism. And I think what the elites have failed to grasp, despite the fact that Biden barely beat Trump, and despite the storming of the Capitol by this enraged mob on January 6th, is that their credibility is dead. That the Trump era, if not Trump himself, is the future. And that the ruling elites embodied by Biden and the Democratic Party, as well as the kind of polite wing of the Republican Party represented by Jeb Bush or Mitt Romney, is headed for the dustbin of history. And then just the way that the liberal wing of the Democratic Party had been eviscerated. And I have to credit a lot of my understanding of corporate power to Ralph Nader. Ralph understands corporate power and has been fighting it with probably more integrity than any American. And Ralph watched, especially with the rise of the Clinton administration, how the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, those people who cared about labor and passing or supporting social programs, were just pushed out by the party, which is why Ralph finally ran for president, because he said, and I agreed with him, that at this point, the only pressure we can bring to bear on the Democratic Party is to pull 5, 10, 15 million people away from the party as a counterweight within a third party to make them respond. I think then I had a kind of hopefulness when we had mass movements that were pushing back against these rapacious centers of power, especially at the end of the Vietnam War, when there was a lot of soul searching in America. We asked questions about ourselves that we hadn't asked before, that we should be asking now. But of course, all of that is gone under this counter assault, which I think Ralph is right. I think that politics is a game of fear, and that the only way to make the Democratic Party respond, and the only reason the elites responded in the 60s wasn't because they had a walk with me Jesus moment. It's because they were scared of these movements. I mean, Kissinger writes that Nixon's standing at the window, terrified, going, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us. And that's where we want people in power to be.
Like Chomsky, you do not think the political left has any business operating with tools of violence or force. But how can you believe in such absolute moral principles when they seem to contradict your assertion that we are doomed by a ruling elite who will stop at nothing to kill us all?
Because they won't work. There's a practical quality to it. Violence is a language the state can speak far better than the rest of us. And the only mechanism we have is essentially, and that's why I support Extinction Rebellion, is sustained acts of mass civil disobedience with the end aim being to overthrow the ruling global elites. I'm not a pacifist. I was in Sarajevo during the war, and we were surrounded by Bosnian Serb forces. The city was protected by a trench system. We knew that if the Bosnian Serbs broke through that trench system, a third of the city would be slaughtered and the rest would be driven to displacement and refugee camps. At that point, you don't have an option. Nobody was sitting in basements in Sarajevo while they were being shelled talking about pacifism or nonviolence. But that doesn't save you from the poison of violence. That is all explored in my book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning.
You've gotten in trouble from the left by basically telling them not to be violent. But if you say it's not possible, but that seems to contradict another conviction you have, that so what if it's not possible? We fight anyway.
Well, I would say that is, if you look back at all the great revolutionaries, Che, and that they went in and out of a kind of what the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr calls sublime madness. Most revolutionaries don't think they're going to succeed. In fact, most don't. So yes, I think that one has a moral duty to resist, even if you're not going to succeed. I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe, which were nonviolent. So I was in East Germany, which is the most sophisticated security surveillance state until our own. And 70,000 people were there, and the regime under Erich Honecker got nervous, and they sent down an elite paratroop division to crush the protests, and they refused to deploy and fire on the crowds. That's how revolutions work, that no revolution succeeds until a significant section of the security apparatus either defects or refuses to defend a discredited regime. And that's the point that we have to get to. And that isn't going to be achieved by carrying out acts of violence, because acts of violence allows the state to demonize the movement. You never get the numbers, which is what they want. If you look at it, so we need the numbers. I was in Alexanderplatz when 500,000 people were in front of the Communist Party headquarters denouncing them. I was in Wenceslas Square when 500,000 people were gathering on the streets of Prague. That's the only mechanism.
Well, wasn't that, a lot of historians would argue that was just sheer ineptitude on behalf of a state capitalist system. They had a war in Afghanistan. They were being outcompeted by China and America. Their economies fell apart. So therefore,
well, but that there is important truth to that. But that's also where we are. I travel around this country, and our cities are just one decayed wreck after another. The endless folly of these wars, which neither the generals or the politicians or anyone else is held accountable for, perpetuate themselves. And then when they finish their military service, they go off to Raytheon, and then they go back to become the Secretary of Defense. I would argue that, we are in the process of internal disintegration, as was the old Soviet Empire. I would say that's true. You make a good point there. I think the problem with the left is that it's too addicted to social media and kind of flash mob type events. That organizing is a very laborious and timely operation. And we don't have, you're right, the kind of organizational structures that the radical left in the United States created before World War I and then in the 1930s with the breakdown of capitalism. So that's why I fear the propensity we have towards proto-fascism, because the left is so weak. I mean, they always talk about at the inception of revolutionary movements, they coalesce around a demand that the ruling elites can never accept because it would mean their own disintegration. And I think that's right. And that is, by the way, what Occupy did. Occupy wasn't outside of Wall Street by chance. They understood that's where real power lay.
So you generally don't believe that there's an electoral solution to our national and local problems?
No, I think that without movements, there's no solution. I mean, as Emma Goldman said, if voting was that effective, it'd be illegal. We have to build movements to hold power in check. That is a people's history of the United States, where he understood that ruling white aristocratic male slaveholders created a closed system. They were terrified of direct or popular democracy, as they repeatedly documented in the Federalist Papers. And it was only through the building of a series of popular movements that we opened up space within the democratic system. And now that space is closed. I mean, even to the point where we're rolling back voting rights legislation.
Given your concern over the welfare of human civilization, what set of actions would you advise anyone watching this to take on?
Well, I mean, the climate emergency is really frightening when you read the climate science. But yeah, that's why I'm kind of involved with Extinction Rebellion, because they realize there's no time left and that the ruling global elites are not going to respond to the greatest existential crisis ever to confront the human species and every other species.
Do you ever see a situation where the two-party monopoly's grip on power on this country can ever be broken? And if so, how?
So the established elite in the two parties is already completely discredited. And that's why Trump just walked all over, the Mitt Romneys and the Jeb Bushes and everyone else. And so the ruling elites have really only one option left, and that is to use the more naked and harsher forms of internal control to maintain power, which they will do. I don't have any hope that any reform will come through the system. At this point, I think it will take an uprising, massive amounts of sustained civil disobedience, as I saw in Eastern Europe, to bring these people down. And I think that there's enough rot within the system that a lot of people aren't going to want to risk themselves to defend it. But I think that's all we have left. So the classic example of liberalism working was the 1930s with Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt, in his private correspondence, which he talks about revolution, and he's saying, in essence, to the oligarchs, we have to give up some of our money now. Otherwise, they're going to take all of our money. That is liberalism working to protect the capitalist system. But what happened after World War II is that in the name of anti-communism, of course, they wiped out all the radical movements. And we have to remember that tens of thousands of people were even down to high school teachers. And the FBI would show up at a high school with a list of teachers with no evidence, or most of them were not members of the Communist Party, but they had a social conscience, and they were out, they were blacklisted, they could never get a job again. The myopia of the ruling elites is that they turned on the very liberal establishment itself. And that's when you created this kind of faux liberalism embodied in figures like Clinton or Obama or Biden, who aren't liberals really. So that is liberalism. Neoliberalism is really unfettered, unregulated capitalism, where you lift all of the controls on a market economy. And so that market economy is allowed to commodify everything. Human beings become commodities. The natural world becomes a commodity that they are then permitted to exploit until exhaustion or collapse. And
I believe that internet censorship, such as the suspension of Trump's account, is a step in the wrong direction. If so, how do we reduce misinformation and propaganda without regulating it?
Right. So the question is, who is regulating it? And these are large monopolistic corporations that are utterly opaque. They know everything about us. We know nothing about them. There's no transparency. And most of the people handling their censorship are taken from the security and surveillance apparatus. So I was opposed to, I don't want to read Trump's tweets any more than anyone else does, but I was opposed to taking him off the internet like that. Because that is handing power to social media platforms. And history has shown that they will always use outliers like Alex Jones, but then they will turn on the left, which is really weak. So WikiLeaks was the first publication they really went after. I mean, that was the template. So it's giving this kind of power. I mean, we saw these digital platforms work on behalf of the Biden administration. So when the contents or some of the contents of Hunter Biden's discarded laptop were exposed in the New York Post, the New York Post was locked out of its own Twitter account. And that's really dangerous. We don't want to give these corporations, remember, Amazon has, I think, $600 million contract with the CIA. I mean, these people are not our friends, and we don't want to give them the power of that kind of censorship.
We should, we should do what we can. So if it means censoring Nazis, for example.
Who's we?
The left, I suppose?
The left doesn't have any power. They're not the ones doing it.
Yeah.
Facebook and Twitter, these are not the left. And they're not our friends. And we don't want to give them that power because they'll wipe us out.
And so in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and sort of the social upheaval that started last year, which has kind of died down now, is the stage set for a populist revolution, or are we sort of going back into the American psychosis?
So I think the tinder is there. I mean, I covered uprisings and revolutions around the world, including the two Palestinian intifadas. As a reporter, you knew that there could be a conflagration, but you never knew what would set it off. And it's always something relatively banal. So for instance, in the first intifada, it was a car accident where a bunch of Palestinian day laborers were killed. I think they were in a van and they were hit by an Israeli truck or something. And that just was, it was the final kind of straw that saw, and the PLO and everybody wasn't expecting it. So that's how it works. It was true in East Germany. That was true in Czechoslovakia. It was true in Romania. I mean, you had a moment where Ceausescu and Elena come out on the balcony, and then the crowd just starts to boo, and they can't get to the roof of the palace fast enough to get a helicopter out. So, that happened in Tunisia when the fruit vendor lit himself on fire. So it's there. Now, that backlash can be a right-wing backlash, but I mean, this is my fear with the Biden administration, that by not addressing the root cause of our malaise, they are guaranteeing blowback. And given the destruction of the left and the disorganization among the left, that blowback, I fear, will be a kind of Trumpian proto-fascist blowback. I think part of the problem with the left is that they have no real relationships with people who are oppressed. So all of my life, I was in El Salvador, Nicaragua. I was in the Middle East, months of my life in Gaza. I was in Sarajevo and Kosovo during the war. And I came back and I immediately started teaching in the prison system. So if you don't walk out of that prison system angry, then you don't have a heart. I mean, something's wrong with you. And I think that when oppressed peoples become abstractions, it's very easy to fall into despair or become cynical. But I walk out of that prison and I'm out, and they're not. I walk out of the largest open air prison in the world, which is Gaza, and I'm out and they're not. And to somehow not fight back is to betray people I care about and have built relationships with. And I think that's where, Augustine said, hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are and the courage to see that they don't remain the way they are. I don't know how familiar you are with the Palestinian struggle, but it's been long. And, let's be frank, it's things have gotten worse and worse and worse, but should we stop? And the mechanism of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, I don't think there's one university that has de-invested, but what that movement has done is raise consciousness, and that's why Israel is so frightened of it. So I think anger, which is different from hate, but anger at what's done to people I care about, and on a very personal level.
Can you elaborate on Israel's role in U.S. elections?
You can't vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs, and you can't vote against the interests of the right-wing Israeli government. We have to be clear that this isn't Israel. It's the rabid right wing of Israel, the racists, and they are racists. And I saw that because I covered Rabin. I knew Rabin. Rabin pushed through Oslo. His fiercest opponents were the Israel lobby from the United States, in particular AIPAC, who funded Likud at the time, hated Rabin. I mean, they were American Jews outside Rabin's house in Herzliya picketing him. Of course, this is dangerous because eventually it led to Rabin's assassination. And
do you think that the left should focus on winning like local state elections, because that's what in the past the Kopers had tried?
I think the problem is that you need so much money to run. I mean, the way the system is built, and the left just doesn't have that kind of money, so you can't get airtime. I mean, I think that our priority should not be electoral politics. I think our priority should be building disciplined, organized, militant, popular movements. And electoral politics can be a part of that movement, but shouldn't be the primary focus. We have to rebuild those organizations because the only strength we have is in our numbers. And if we use those numbers correctly, we can pit power against power, but that requires organization. And I think, getting sucked into the electoral system and putting all of your energy into it is a mistake, which doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but that shouldn't be your primary focus.
In your view, is there a way in which you can create deep, meaningful art in the way of, but still avoid spectacle?
I think the problem is that when people rely on visual images for information and sever themselves from a print-based culture, they're easily manipulated because images are emotionally driven. But I think the problem with a society that is solely dependent on images is that they lose so much context that they're easily swayed one way or another, and they don't have the kind of critical faculties to judge, I guess would be the best way to put it.
Due to the impact of COVID-19, you see that in New York that they're starting something called a COVID passport. My question is, what do you think will be its effects in the rest in all of America, and do you think it will affect the minority and poor class?
A disproportionate number of people in the healthcare industry are people of color. I think so. You already have a healthcare system, which of course is profit driven, that is, and you've seen with the consolidation of hospitals and closing of hospitals, how poor communities have lost access to medical care. So you already have that assault. And then in terms of the passport, that's one more way to register you, and it's one more way to exclude you. And everything is more difficult when you're poor. Not just in terms of the logistics, but the access, because the access is disproportionate. It's like the whole system now is designed against the poor. And I think that that passport system will be no exception.
And because I think that the best care for society would be a free market, which you contend it doesn't exist. Like, what do you think?
Well, I don't know how after 2018 anybody can pretend the free market exists. I mean, that was socialism for the rich on a massive scale. I mean, if people really believed in the free market, then all of these banks, AIG and Citibank, and they all would have gone under. I mean, it's a fantasy. It doesn't exist. I mean, my problem with capitalism is that it brings with it a kind of ethic, and that ethic is one of exploitation, of deception, of hoarding, of inequality. And, I have a dark enough view of human nature to know that there are people who are in any society who are driven by that, but it has to be heavily regulated, because once it takes over, I mean, this is why Marx called capitalism at its core a revolutionary force, because once it takes over, and go back, and Marx was right about this, that what it does is it begins, after it devastates the system, which it has already done in the United States, it cannibalizes the very structures that make capitalism possible. So they want to privatize healthcare, they want to privatize education. 60% of intelligence work are done by private agencies like Bose Allen Hamilton. I have to go to these halfway houses that are all privatized, and They're not trying to provide any kind of care to people making that transition from prison to freedom. It's just all about exploitation. So, you don't want, for instance, capitalists to control your health service. You create a system, as we have, where parents are forced to bankrupt themselves to save their sons and daughters. So, but the whole notion of a free market, especially now, is a myth. I mean, all these large financial service firms are being given money at virtually 0% interest. And then, of course, how do they make their money? It's as soon as we can't pay our credit card on time, we're paying 18% interest. I don't even know whether that's capitalism or not. I think it's just extortion.
What's your take on the current Muslim Holocaust in China? His words.
I mean, I from a distance, so I've not been there, and as a reporter, I am always somewhat skeptical of places I haven't reported from. I don't think there's any question that the Uyghur community is targeted, and that the forms of surveillance, many of them facial recognition cameras put up in public areas, etc., are kind of what's coming to us. But at the same time, these are kind of the only Muslims America seems to care about anywhere in the world. And that means that they have a vested interest in promoting and perhaps even exaggerating those human rights abuses as a way to demonize China. But I don't speak as an expert. But that Uyghurs have been targeted. I mean, Uyghurs have long been targeted in Xinjiang. That's not anything new. It's what Chomsky calls acceptable and unacceptable victims. So, when I covered the war in Central America, there were Catholic priests who were murdered by the death squads in El Salvador, and the Reagan administration didn't say anything. And at the same time, the communist government in Poland killed a Catholic priest. And it was all over the front pages of every paper, and they couldn't stop talking about it. And so the Uyghurs have been adopted by imperial powers as a way to discredit China. And I don't want to defend China as a totalitarian system, but the Chinese have lifted 180 million people out of extreme poverty. I mean, and those are World Bank figures, by the way. They're not Chinese government figures.
And hello, I don't understand why should we only use peaceful protests when the state seems used to suppressing peaceful protests, as seen in BLM, which seems to preach only peaceful protests but get demonized. How do we get people to react when they're in their own bubbles?
Okay, so that's two questions. I mean, there is a moral aspect to not using violence, although, by extension, I used violence. When I was covering northern Iraq after Saddam withdrew, the stories saw Saddam Hussein put a price on my head, and I had 7 bodyguards, and they certainly would have pulled the trigger if we came under attack. So, there are moments when I accept the necessity of violence. I just think it's important to realize that revolutions, and who wrote about this quite presciently of all people was Lenin. Even though Lenin's brother was executed for being involved in a plot to assassinate the Tsar, Lenin himself kept trying to stomp down anarchist violence because he saw it as detrimental to the revolution. Revolutions work because they're primarily nonviolent, in the same way that even though there was an armed wing to the ANC, by the time the apartheid regime was overthrown, what brought it down were massive largely nonviolent protests, especially out of the townships, as well as the sanctions that were imposed from the outside on the apartheid regime. Revolutions work when when regimes are so discredited that nobody wants to defend them. I mean, and you just go back and look. I mean, for instance, when the Shah fled Iran, the next day, the head of the armed forces said that the armed forces wouldn't fire in the streets of Tehran or Qom or anywhere else to defend the regime. That's it. It was over. And that's the moment you need to reach. But it's very hard to reach that when you use violence. Even if you look at the Cuban, I mean, one of the biggest damage that, the most damaging thing that the Cuban revolutionaries did is this whole FOCO theory, In fact, what brought down Batista and the Cuban regime were nationwide strikes, which crippled the country. And when Batista fled the country, Fidel and the Barbudos were, 4 days away. They had to hop into trucks to get into Havana. So yes, they were certainly, but then the mythology of the revolution came, centered around the FOCO being that kind of violent group that led members of Students for a Democratic Society to form the Weather Underground, even though the North Vietnamese told them not to, in the anti-war movement. And then that saw, of course, Che killed and executed on the orders of Washington, on the orders of the US government in Bolivia when he tried to build a kind of FOCO in Bolivia. So if I was an Iraqi or an Afghani and my country was being occupied by US NATO forces, yes, of course, then, in wars of occupation, you are only going to drive the occupier out through violence primarily. Although, again, you have Gandhi's example in India, but then people say, would Gandhi have been able to do it without the British press, which is a kind of fair question. Also, you have to accept that the British ruling class and the military was decimated after World War I, so they didn't have the bodies either in order to occupy the empire. But my argument within the United States is that it isn't going to work. There is a moral component to it, but when faced with the possibility of annihilation, as I was in Sarajevo, I fully understood why the Muslim-led government in Sarajevo, in fact, I was quite angry at the international community for the arms blockade, which meant that the Muslims had small arms and small mortars, and the Serbs were dropping Katyusha rockets and the equivalent of 155 howitzers and 90 millimeter tank rounds on us by the hundreds, day in and day out. It was just, unacceptable. So there are moments when I would put it this way, you don't have a choice but to use violence. But to go down the route of violence by challenging the ruling elites in the United States, I think is a disaster. We can't do that language. I mean, we have 36,000 people in the American Armed Forces that are in special forces units, SEALs, Marine, Range. I've seen these people at work. These are death squads. And they have an efficiency to kill that we're never going to be able to replicate. And so if we go down that route, we're going to lose.